Hello and welcome to Flip Bama Flip. I'm your host, Victoria, and the 2026 women's college gymnastics season is officially over. And it ended on Saturday with Oklahoma winning their second in a row, with LSU coming in second by a very small margin. Florida came in third, and Minnesota was in fourth. And after the meet on Sunday, it was either Sunday or Monday, I recorded something and I talked about the fan experience. I talked about what it was like to be there. Dickies Arena did a fantastic job. I'm hoping that it kind of becomes the permanent location, the same way that Omaha is where the College World Series always is. They did a great job in terms of making it really about the fans this year. And Samuel L. Jackson was at the meet. And for your football fans, Mike Tomlin was there. I mean, there was a lot of really fun stuff going on. There was, of course, a lot of really great gymnastics. There was a lot to talk about. But when I went back and I reviewed it in light of what the conversation online has become about the meet, I felt like I had talked about something that I really was like, this is the conversation that we need to be having. And we're going to have tons of times to talk about the flips and the twists and all the everything else. But in some ways, there's a little bit of a black cloud over this championship because there's a lot of discussion about whether or not the right team won. And my own opinion is that we don't know. We don't know if the right team won. Again, it was extremely close. And when it comes down to that, yes, a judging error one way or the other could make a difference. But unless you go back and you rescore every single routine, you're not going to know if, quote unquote, the right team won. But there are a lot of feelings about it. And I would say when we remove the Oklahoma fan base, we remove the LSU fan base, because of course they've got kind of a vested interest in this argument. I think what we're hearing from the more quote unquote neutral fan bases is that they felt like Oklahoma was a bit overscored. They felt like LSU was overscored at times, but underscored at times. They felt like Florida was generally underscored on floor, and that Minnesota in general, of course, not every single routine, was a bit underscored. That's kind of the general feel of how people were feeling. And I kind of had a unique perspective because I was sitting in a neutral section. I was sometimes when I buy my tickets, because I don't know who's going to be there, I end up in like someone's fan base. I was in Missouri's fan base last year, and Oklahoma. I always end up in Oklahoma section, but I was actually in a truly neutral section. And so it was really interesting to hear what people had to say. And unfortunately, it didn't take long for kind of the grumblings about scoring to get started. And so what is interesting to me is how the discussions are occurring, because they kind of follow this formula. Okay, it's real simple. Somebody posts something that says, OU won. Back-to-back champions. OU is your 2026 gymnastics champions. Then there's a slew of comments stating that the wrong team won, that LSU was robbed, that the only reason Oklahoma won is because they're chronically overscored, yada, yada, yada. Then the OU fan base comes back and they say, no, we deserved this. Our girls were just better. You're a sore loser. And then we start getting into the back and the forth and then name calling, etc. Right? All the things that we know are really helpful when you're trying to, have a productive discussion. But what's interesting is that inevitably somewhere in those threads, someone mentions the word bias, and that sparks this kind of train wreck, I guess you could say, of a conversation, because the moment someone mentions bias, you get a response from one side that's like, yep, looks like the checks have cleared, and the other side saying like, oh yes, yeah, you're right, we've been paying the judges for years, just nobody's known about it, we've managed to keep it quiet. And as an outsider watching this conversation, my first thought is, y'all are talking about two different things. Bias is not the same as a bribe, which is what the conversation inevitably turns to, and this idea of intentional cheating. And so Do I think that Oklahoma is sitting there with their checkbook and writing little checks to the Women's Judges Association? No, I don't. I think that's absurd. Um, Nor do I think that they have people with bags of money or briefcases of money, handing it to the judges and the judges saying, okay, I'm going to intentionally misscore these routines. No, I don't. I think that's absurd. We don't have any evidence that that's happening. And I honestly don't think that that is what's happening. Now, I come to you all and I talk to you guys about gymnastics because that's my passion. But my other passion is what I do for a living, and that's psychology. And I think there's a lot of psychology here. So I'm going to take us on a little bit of a detour, but hang with me because I think this is a conversation that is worth having. And so in my line of work, so again, I'm a psychologist, I do evaluations and I do them for forensic matters. So my field talks about bias all the time. I don't think that there's a day or a week that goes by that I'm not having a discussion with someone about bias. And the main reason is that in our line of work, we want to minimize bias as much as possible so it doesn't affect the outcome. But when we talk about bias in its true sense, we're talking about a process that occurs largely outside of somebody's conscious awareness. And it isn't just a singular thing. So someone will say, oh, the judges are biased. I'm always like, well, which kind of bias? Because there's hindsight bias, there's recency bias, there's primacy bias, there's availability heuristics, there's confirmation bias, the list goes on and on and on. So when we say someone is biased, it's not saying that they have a personality flaw, that they are dumb, that they're incompetent. It is actually, as a psychologist, when I hear it, I'm like, oh, they are engaging in something that all humans engage in, which is bias, because our brains are trying to make sense of an absolutely absurd amount of information throughout our days. And the only ways that our brains can do that is if they become really efficient. And the ways that our brain does that is by making these little shortcuts, these little algorithms to help them synthesize data faster. That leads to bias. So if you are a human and you have a brain that is trying to make sense of your world, I hate to break it to you, you have biases. And I think the faster that we can get to that point where we recognize it as, again, it's not a personality flaw, it's not something about you that you're bad, you're biased. The sooner we can get to it as acceptance of this is here because we have humans judging a subjective sport, the faster we can actually have productive conversations about, okay, how do we mitigate bias? Because you can't really eliminate it. The only way to eliminate it is to have non-humans do it, which I don't think that's on the horizon, although I don't know, maybe it is. But as long as humans are judging the sport, bias will be there. And I'll give you an example of a bias that I think we cannot ignore when you're looking at a subjective sport, and that is expectancy bias. The idea that our brains want to perceive things that are consistent with what we expect to see. So knowing a team's reputation, whether it's an overall reputation, whether it's how are they on a specific event, knowing maybe that they're the national leaders on a certain event, what we know about the gymnast. Is this a gymnast who has been racking up tens all season, or is this a gymnast who's generally kind of like a 9-8 kind of gymnast? All that information, our brain is already using to kind of preform an opinion. Now, again, this is not that judge sitting down and saying, well, this gymnast normally scores in the 9-8, so I'm going to put her in the 9-8 bucket, and she's going to have to really prove to me that she's not in a 9-9 or worthy of a 10. They're not consciously thinking that. But are we outside of our conscious awareness thinking that? Yes, because our brain is trying to be efficient. And it can be the difference between approaching a routine as prove to me that this is a 10 versus prove to me that this is not a 10. So where do I start? Do I start at a 10, expecting to see a 10, and you've got to do something, kind of pretty big to bump me off of that? Or am I starting you maybe more around a 9.8, and I'm expecting you to show me something super great that's going to bump me up out of that range? So that expectancy bias is there. None of those judges walked into the meet on Saturday and were like, Oklahoma? Never heard of them. Are they good? Or on Thursday, who is this Jordan Childs person? Has she done anything in the sport? No, they know who these teams are. They know who these gymnasts are. Therefore, regardless of how good of a judge they are, that bias is there, whether we like it or not. Likewise, not a single judge came into that meet on Saturday unaware that Minnesota had a 14 in front of their name. And I would be very, very surprised. In fact, I would find it extremely hard to believe that any of the judges came into the meet and were like, over my dead body is Minnesota winning. I am going to score them low to ensure that they do not get the championship. No, that's absurd. That did not happen. But did the fact that they knew that Minnesota was the Cinderella team, that they were the number 14 team, not normally grouped with Oklahoma and LSU and Florida, did that affect how they perceived the meet and Minnesota's performances? I'm sure it did. And again, not consciously. So if you asked a judge, are you biased towards Oklahoma? Are you biased against Minnesota? They're going to tell you no. And not because they're, a liar or because they're a bad person or they're trying to cover up the scheme that some people think is going on. It's because, again, this is operating outside of your conscious awareness. It's why when you ask most people, are you biased? They're like, no, I'm not biased. We're not aware of our biases. And so I think the first step is we have to be able to get comfortable talking about bias. Like I said, my field, we talk about it all the time. And so there's not that level of defensiveness. Some people get defensive, but once we start talking about it as if you're an evaluator and you're a human with a brain, you have biases. And so we need to talk about it. Then you can start looking at productive solutions. And so, for example, in my field, we do things like we use decision trees, or we specifically design our methodology to minimize where bias comes in. But the two things that are most important are peer review and peer consultation. And I will tell you, when I first started doing this line of work, I absolutely hated being reviewed. I mean, to the point that I considered not doing this work anymore because it was so uncomfortable. I mean, it really, and in my line of work, I mean, people testify about it. So it's very public. It's very, it's very humbling. But at times it felt attacking. At times it felt personal. At times it felt really unfair. But at the end of the day, it was the single thing that improved my work the most was being reviewed by my peers, because they were able to see the blind spots that I couldn't see of things that were happening outside of my conscious awareness. And so as uncomfortable as it was the best thing in terms of actually improving the work that I did. And so my understanding is that college gymnastics has some form of this. It's something called the scoreboard. But the problem is that judges can opt out of it. And again, early on in my career, if you asked me like, hey, would you rather be reviewed or would you rather not be reviewed? I would have been like, I'd rather not be reviewed. Because again, it's uncomfortable. It creates anxiety. It creates sometimes frustration. Sometimes it makes you doubt yourself. But if you can tolerate all those things, you will get better. And so the thing is that there's nothing about this peer review that says this has to be a humiliating process or this has to be a public process. I'm not suggesting that we take the judges and we drag them out to the town square and put them in the stocks and throw rotten tomatoes at them. This can be done in-house and done in a way where it's very clear the purpose of the review is to improve performance. It is not to tear people down. And I think that's a really important aspect of it, because I always felt really, well, not always, I think most of the time I felt really supported by the people who were reviewing me. And it was clear that their intent was to help me improve my product. And ultimately, that is what happened. And so I'm extremely grateful for those opportunities, even though they were really uncomfortable in the moment. And so again, I think it all starts with being able to have the conversation about bias without people getting upset. It's not saying the wrong team won. It's not saying that there is a systemic agenda to keep certain teams at the top and keep other teams at the bottom. It's the idea that you have humans with brains that are trying to judge something that is subjective. Bias is going to leak in. And if we can talk about it in a non-defensive way, then we can also start to talk about solutions. And I know there's been interviews with other people about other aspects. I don't think this is the end all be all. And if you fix this, then all of the issues go away. Are there issues with training? Are there issues with keeping your skills up? Things like that. There may be. Now, a review process would hopefully also correct some of those things. But again, I don't think that it's necessarily the only solution, but I think it's probably a part of the solution at least. And I think it's important because I think that we owe it to everybody who is spending time, spending money on the sport. Because one of the sad things was in reading people's responses, there were a number of comments like, hey, I tuned in to finals and I was reminded why I stopped watching the sport, because of the judging. We hear that a bit. Now, me, I'm never going to stop watching. I'm never going to stop going. I'm never going to stop cheering. But it is frustrating and I can see why some people do. And so it is a growing sport. That was one of the things that was really great that came out of the weekend. I think they said 1.1 million people watched the finals, which is huge. It's a sport that's growing and we want to keep it growing in the positive direction. But things like this, scoring controversies or this undercurrent, because it's not like this is the first year we're talking about scoring issues. It's not like this is the second year we're talking about scoring issues. Do I think we're going to be talking about scoring issues? Yes. Next year? Yes. Without taking active steps, this is not something that is simply going to go away. And so I think we owe it to the athletes who put in so much time. I mean, literally a lifetime of training and a lifetime of work and heart and money, and everybody deserves better. And frankly, the judges deserve better too, because they're kind of getting raked through the mud for something that all of us do. Again, all of us who are humans have biases. And so they deserve a system that helps them minimize that so that they can do the best job, because I truly think that that's what they want to do. Again, I don't think anyone stepped into Dickey's Arena on Saturday and was like, I'm going to intentionally misscore things. But I think we could see examples of where bias probably did creep in based on their expectancy of what they expected to see or what they saw other people see. And the problem with our perceptions is whatever we perceive, that's also what we retain in our memory, and that's what we recall at a later date. So again, if they perceive it incorrectly, when they recall it, if they're not looking at an instant replay, they're going to recall that misperception. So there's a lot of cognitive processes going on. I know this is kind of a detour from what we normally talk about, but the conversation that's being had online is one about intentional cheating, bribery, all those things. And I think that's just us chasing our tails. That's not the discussion that needs to be had. But if we can have an honest discussion about bias, maybe we can start coming up with some actual solutions. I don't know. But that's kind of my thoughts. I will kind of wrap up the season in terms of the more gymnastics-y part, but I kind of just felt like I needed to get that off my chest and talk about it because there is so much swirling about the judging and the scores. And when you have meets that are this close, some of it's a little bit inevitable, but I think also just the way that it was, even from the neutral fans, they just kind of left a bad taste in everyone's mouth. And so congratulations, of course, to Oklahoma, who won. We are already looking forward to next season, and we'll start covering what our recruits are doing in their regional and national qualifying meets. Lots of good things. Coach Ashley just posted something about all the individuals who have been qualifying. I think she said something like 9 have qualified to DP Nationals. And so really exciting stuff to look forward to. And we will start talking about that next week. Until then, roll Tide.